So thank you very much, and welcome to all of you to this history group presentation. So let's get started. The Latin American countries gained their independence after long and cruel wars, starting in 1810, about 1810, and ending anywhere between 1818 and 1825. These were, of course, the de facto independence dates following the last military actions. So the question is, well, what happened after that? Many countries called that period the Republic. And so I have chosen to tell you the story of the Republic of Venezuela because it's the one I know best. But at the end, I will try to compare its history with the history of a few other Latin American countries. So regarding northern South America, Simón Bolívar had a great idea, La Gran Colombia. He wanted to unify Venezuela, today's Colombia and today's Ecuador, into one country called La Gran Colombia, and he succeeded. They drew a constitution in 1821. Bolívar was named the first president of the Gran Colombia, and he remained the president of Gran Colombia until 1830, when the whole thing collapsed. And so the Venezuelan history, or the history of the Venezuelan Republic, really starts in 1830. Now, the wars of independence devastated all Latin American countries, but very especially Venezuela. The population, economy, education, health, and government, they all suffered. The population of Venezuela in about 1810, around 1810, was estimated to be about 1 million people. By 1823, at the end of the independence wars, it was 2/3 of that number. In other words, about 1/3 of the whole population of the country perished during the wars of independence. Of course, the economy was in tatters, very little production, mainly just agricultural products. Education, well, literacy in the country was in the single digits at that time. And there were endemic diseases, malaria, yellow fever, Chagas disease. They're all widespread. And on top of that, the country acquired a huge foreign debt. So these conditions helped the establishment of caudillismo. In order to understand the history of Latin America, we must understand the concept of caudillismo. Caudillo, the word in Spanish, means the head of a political or military faction. And caudillismo is a system of political power based on the leadership of and the allegiance to a strongman, the caudillo, or the warlord. Warlord is very apt because they're all, most of the time they were warriors. So it was an informal system of sustained obedience based on a paternalistic relationship between the leader and the subordinates, attained as a result of forceful personality and charisma. So there was this person who offered to protect his people in exchange for fealty. And this is how he was successful in recruiting troops and govern in his own little area or big area, depending of where he was. A typical caudillo was an experienced military leader. He had a strong personality. He was audacious. He had physical vigor. He had ambition for power, yes. He had a knack for ruling. Somehow he knew how to do that. He had charisma. Usually he was a good speaker. He was often cruel. There is an example of Juan Manuel de Rosas, an Argentinian caudillo who ruled between 1829 and 1852. He was called the Caligula of River Plate. And he was often uneducated. Now, caudillos arose from the wars of independence of the Latin American independence. But the term has been extended to any kind of personalized leadership that exercises power in an arbitrary manner within a context of weak and unstable political institutions. Even today, there are caudillos. Some caudillos whose names you will recognize are Pancho Villa, northern Mexico, Emiliano Zapata, southern Mexico, Francisco Franco from Spain, Rafael Trujillo from the Dominican Republic, of course Fidel Castro, and of course Hugo Chavez. Now, not all authoritarian rulers were caudillos. Some of them, like these, Leopoldo Galtieri of Argentina, he was a general. Miguel Díaz-Canel, he is the president of Cuba today, and Nicolás Maduro, he is the president of Venezuela today. They were not caudillos. They didn't have the charisma. They didn't have many of the other properties of a true caudillo. But they ruled, and they ruled by raw power. Now, the first president of the Republic of Venezuela was José Antonio Páez. He was a caudillo who was also had been a military hero in the War of Independence. He was of humble origin, limited education. He became a cattle trader. But early in the war, he joined the private army, a cavalry squadron to fight the royalists. He was a very skilled horseman, and he learned the art of war by fighting it. He became the leader of the plainsmen, llaneros in Spanish, who were excellent warriors. In one occasion, with only 153 lancers, he did serious damage to a 6,000 troop royalist army. That battle is the one that is being depicted in this painting. And after the War of Independence, he became involved in politics. And here he is in his later days as president. He was influential in the breakup of the Gran Colombia. Now, he wasn't going to take orders from those people 1,000 miles away. He just wasn't going to do that. And so he achieved his objective of being the caudillo of Venezuela, and Venezuela alone. And he ruled Venezuela for 22 years. He was head of state 3 times. Now, when I mean ruled, I mean that he was the strong man. He was the decision maker, but not necessarily the head of state. He put head of state what he wanted and took them off if he wanted to. He was the strong man. So for the first 33 years of the Republic, Venezuelan rulers were caudillos, who also had been military heroes of the War of Independence. And the following 82 years, with one short exception, we'll talk about that, the rulers were other caudillos, different caudillos. So here is the events timeline from 1830 till 1945. And well, you can see that it was essentially, the country was ruled by caudillos. There was only one exception in 1859, almost an aberration, a mistake. Manuel Felipe Tovar, he was a civilian, and he was elected by popular vote. That was the only time in this 115 years that there was a popular vote in the country. But unfortunately, his presidency lasted only 20 months. So until from 1830 to 1935 here, there were 6 caudillos who ruled the country. Now, although there were 46 heads of state in that time, which if you do the math is about 2.5 years per head of state, the caudillos ruled 115 years, 6 of them, which means about 17.5 years for each of them. Now, there were many caudillos in the country, but of course only one ruled the whole country. The rest of them, or many of them, jockeyed for that position. And so there was armed struggle. And between 1830 and 1935, there were 23 armed rebellions against the federal government. Wow. And here is the distribution of these rebellions. If you include the 1940s, it becomes 26. And the law was also manipulated. There were 15 constitutions passed between 1830 and 1945. And they were not just amendments, I mean, like we have in the United States. They were really seriously different constitutions. So under these circumstances, it is very, very difficult to build a country. So the government's meager resources that came from import-export tariffs and some other taxes were used mainly to fund the struggles. So no funds, no time, or frankly, no interest were left for schools, hospitals, infrastructure, or other initiatives. And so socially, economically, and educationally, little has changed from 1800 to 1920. Venezuela remained a poor, uneducated, agrarian, semi-feudal country whose economy was based on coffee and cacao. The literacy at this time, at 1920s, was about 30%. So in 1908, Gomez became the ruler through a coup until 1935, 27 years. Gomez was born into a prominent family of Andean landowners, but he himself remained illiterate, essentially. He barely could read. He was a smart man, very smart indeed, but he was not educated. In 1899, he joined the private army that eventually seized power of the whole country. And he became vice president of Venezuela in 1902 and head of the military with the rank of general. In 1908, the sitting president, named Cipriano Castro, who was also a caudillo, he went to Europe for a medical treatment. And Gomez, well, he sent him a get well card and a message not to come back. And well, he could not come back. And so Gomez took over power, and he sat there for until 1935. He was a caudillo, of course, and he was a tyrant. His secret police was brutal, but well, he brought peace during his regime and even beyond his regime. At that time, the large fields were discovered, 1910s, and concessions to mainly American companies were granted. By 1922, Venezuela was a major exporter, and so money started pouring in. What did they do with it? Well, the foreign debt was paid off. Some infrastructure was built, roads and bridges and hospitals and so on. Education, though, was not a priority. The caudillo himself, he was illiterate. He did not think that education was important. But furthermore, he did think that uneducated people are easier to control. So the education was not helped out. Even then, it started creeping up, and by 1930, the literacy of the country was about 40%. After Gomez's death in 1935, and for 2 presidential periods, generals ruled. Now, these governments were essentially an extension of Gomez's rule. They changed very few manners of dealing with the government, but they were more tolerant, and they allowed some dissent that Gomez did not allow before them. Like media, the radios, newspapers were allowed to criticize the government. Political parties were allowed to become to get created. Unions also were allowed to be created. And actually, democracy really emerged from this period of time. And then in 1945, civilians with military help overthrew the ruling military. Wow. It usually is the other way around. It usually is the military that overthrows civilian governments, but this time it was civilians overthrowing the ruling military. And the reason was that they did not want the country to continue in the same path. They did this coup with the express purpose of writing a new constitution based on democracy. And they lived up to their word. The revolutionary government junta, led by civilians, they wrote a new constitution. The new constitution established popular vote. Finally, after 1859, independent Congress. Well, this is a novelty. Independent municipalities, another novelty. So they finished their work and they called for elections. And the very first popular elections since 1859 in the country were held in 1947. Romulo Gallegos was elected president. Romulo Gallegos was a well-known novelist and a politician. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1960. So finally, democracy. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. In less than a year, he was overthrown by a military coup. Marcos Pérez Jiménez became the ruler for 10 years. He was not a caudillo. He ruled by sheer force, military power. But that's the way it was. At this time, you may remember some of the names. You may remember the name of Marcos Pérez Jiménez and the names of some other people I'm going to mention. So Marcos Pérez Jiménez was overthrown in 1958. Democracy restarts. And so there were elections. Rómulo Betancourt is elected president in 1959, and he actually finished his term. He was the first president, first elected president who actually finished his term. Although he did have 6 coup attempts to overthrow his government, he survived them all. The following 5 presidents also finished their term. So it seemed that, democracy was really getting a hold of the country. In 1974, the price of petroleum went from $3.5 to $12 a barrel. And Carlos Andrés Pérez was the president of Venezuela at that time, and he decided to invest the windfall in order to diversify Venezuela's economy and to actually make Venezuela a developed country. He also nationalized the petroleum industry in 1976. A river of cash flooded the country. But what this caused really was more corruption. I was living in Venezuela at this time, and I had a relatively high position at the university. And so I got to know certain things. I got to know firsthand about some types of corruption. I'll give you 2 examples. A salesman from a paint factory goes into the government office to sell the government 1 million gallons of paint at $1 a gallon. The government buyer tells him, okay, we'll buy 1 million gallons of paint, but the price is not right. It has to be $2. What? Aren't you going the wrong direction? I said, no. It has to be $2. And so they settle. The government buys the 1 million gallons of paint for $2 million. The salesman gives the government buyer $1 million personally, and he keeps the other $1 million, which is what he wanted in the first place. It turns out that the seller was a good friend of mine. So this comes from the horse's mouth. Example 2. The government needs some type of software, and the government buyer gives the contract to a friend for $500,000. Produce this software for us. Here is the money. The friend, let's call him A. A goes to B and says, listen, will you generate this software for me, and I'll give you $200,000. And B goes to C and tells him that, will you please do this job for me, and I'll give you $75,000. And C goes to D, and D actually does the work for $35,000. Well, D was also a good friend of mine, so this also comes from the horse's mouth. And there were many, many more examples like that, and I know a number of them. So the problems with the democratic governments, the Venezuelan democratic governments, was corruption at multiple levels, extensive. Another problem was the inability to diversify the economy. 95% of the export was oil. And no matter what they did, no matter how they tried, they were unable to diversify the economy. And I have to say that, there was an attitude. There were no good examples to emulate within the government employees. Very few of them really had experience. And so they just did not do a good job. And this went on from government to government. And instead of learning and getting better, somehow they just got worse. The corruption became deeper. The ineptitude somehow became worse. And so in 1992, Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez launched a coup. It failed and he was jailed. Now, Chavez wanted to end corruption and achieve social justice. Those were his goals. He was, indeed, somewhat of an idealist. So it happened that the ninth president of this new era pardoned Chavez, and then Chavez ran for president, and he won in 1999. Now, Chavez was a caudillo. He was from the military, he was audacious, he had led a coup. He had a strong personality, he was very confident. He was ambitious. He had charisma. He was a very good speaker. He could speak for hours, 5, 6 hours, and people would not get bored. So there was a coup attempt in 2002, and he survived it. And after that, he became a dictator. So why did Chavez win the elections? Well, it's really relatively simple. It's because the people were tired of these governments, one after the other, getting worse and worse, and the issues of corruption and distribution of the money were going the wrong way. So they wanted somebody who was a savior, somebody who was a strong man. The people wanted a caudillo. This is Hugo Chavez in about the year 2000. He died of cancer in 2013. But before he died, he handpicked Nicolás Maduro to take over after him. And he did, and he's still the president of Venezuela under a military dictatorship. So here is the Venezuelan timeline in all of its history, the 190-year history of Venezuela. The red is the caudillo or authoritarian regimes, and the green are the democratic regimes. Obviously, there is a lot more red than green. They had 66 heads of state in that period of time, 37 armed revolts against the federal government, 19 constitutions. So how does this compare with some of the other Latin American countries? Well, let's take a look. Here is Mexico. In the early years, there was one main caudillo. His name was General Santa Anna of the Alamo and San Jacinto battles fame. He ruled for 22 years, and he was the head of state 11 times. After him came Benito Juarez. Benito Juarez was a civilian, but he also was a caudillo. But he was an enlightened person. and he was somewhat less authoritarian. He ruled from 1857 to 1872. But during his rule, the French, who claimed unpaid debts by Mexico, they invaded the country and installed an emperor, Maximilian I. Maximilian was the younger brother of Franz Joseph, who was the emperor of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. So he became Maximilian I, and during this time, there were two governments in Mexico, the Empire and Benito Juarez. The Empire was eventually defeated. Maximilian was executed by a firing squad, and the sort of democratic government of Benito Juarez continued. Now, besides the problem with the French, Mexico had other international wars. Of course, the one that we most know is the Mexican-American War. That was in 1946 to 48, and it caused a lot of damage to Mexico. But a lot more damage was caused under the Mexican Revolution in the decade of the 1910s. They had a 10-year civil war, and it was really devastating. The estimates are that 2 to 3 million Mexicans died during that internal war. And you can tell, perhaps, I don't know if you can see this, but this is the population of Mexico that had been growing slowly. But in 1910, the population of Mexico was 15.1 million. In 1920, it was also 15.1 million. In other words, this proves the devastation in population that occurred under the Mexican Revolution. This pink part here is pink because, well, it is an authoritarian era, but not of a caudillo, but by a party. The PRI, Partido Revolucionario Institucional, was in charge during all this period of time, and they were the perfect dictatorship. Nothing was decided without the party. The party decided it all. And that only ended by President Fox in 2000, the year 2000, when finally the PRI party was defeated at the polls. Let's take another country, Colombia. Well, Colombia has a red beginning and then a sort of a very decent green democratic history. They had 65 heads of state, and they had 16 armed revolts against the federal government. However, 2 of these revolts were really devastating to the country. There was one in 1948 to 1958. It was a civil war. And it was called the violence. That's the name that they gave this period of time. Again, a lot of people died under this civil war. 200 to 300,000 is the estimate. And the other period, starting about 1964, is of the FARC, the F-A-R-C, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia. That civil war lasted 52 years. It only ended in 2016. This green part here is mainly due to the agreement that the two major parties in Colombia made at the end of the 50s. And the decision was, the agreement was, that they would rule intermittently. One term would be the Conservative Party, the next term will be the Liberal Party, and so on. And they succeeded in doing just that. And again, that is one of the reasons why this era here is democratic. Peru. Again, it's a similar pattern as what we have seen before. There's a lot of red. And they had 60 heads of state in the same period of time, 1830 to 2020. And they had 28 armed revolts against the federal government. However, Peru had 4 international wars in its history. The first one in 1836 to 1839 was with Bolivia. Essentially, it was the attempt to unify the two countries that eventually, of course, did not succeed. In 1857 to 1860, Peru had a war with Ecuador, during which it took a huge chunk of territory from Ecuador and annexed it to Peru. And then in 1879 to 1884, 5 years, they had a war with Chile. This was a devastating war for the country. This was due to the guano deposits that the two countries were fighting for. And because of that, it's called the Guano War. Argentina. The early history of Argentina, it is the Buenos Aires pitted against the rest of the country. And it wasn't until really 1861 that the country finally unified. In the late 1800s, Argentina had a vigorous immigration policy and program. And because of that, or a good measure because of that, their literacy has increased a lot more than other countries did. They also had a program, a literacy program, that was very vigorous as well. In addition to that, Argentina had a program of exports of meats and grains that was very successful. In fact, this whole era between, I don't know, 1870 or to about 1840, economically, Argentina was doing relatively well. But then came Perón, Juan Domingo Perón. He came into the picture around 1943 when he was a colonel and he participated in a coup. He became the Minister of Labor, and eventually, 3 years later, he became the President of Argentina. Now, Perón was really a true caudillo. He was paternalistic, mainly to labor and the syndicates. And during his presidency, he was quite populist, and he introduced these paternalistic and populist policies that favored mainly labor and the syndicates. For example, foreign exchange control over the prices, and that was a big deal, control of rents even control of restaurant menus. The prices on the menus were controlled for a period of time. And the protectionist policies of the national industry and the nationalization of foreign companies, for example, the railroads, all that happened under Peron. And it did not succeed really, because it spurred the rise in prices and inflation, and it did a lot of damage to the country overall. But Peronism, in other words, a government in the style of Peron, survives even today. Today's president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, is a Peronist. So let me give you a glimpse of the overall picture of these countries. Again, the red is caudillo authoritarian rule and the green is democratic rule. And well, overall, it's a lot more red than green. Venezuela had 66 heads of state, 37 armed revolts. Mexico had 96 heads of state, the same number of revolts. Colombia has 65 heads of states, 16 revolts, but they had two very lengthy and damaging internal wars. Peru, 60 heads of state, 28 revolts, but they had 4 international wars. And Argentina, 73 heads of states and 23 armed revolts. I would like to show you one more plot, and that is the literacy in Latin America. As you can see, Argentina is a different case, a special case, mainly because of its immigration policies and educational policies as well. It is interesting to point out that about 1950, most of these countries had a literacy of about 50%. Of course, today we are all in the high 90%. And so today Venezuela is in ruin. The oil industry is in tatters. Venezuela is the poorest country in Latin America today, even poorer than Cuba and Haiti. And so, well, it's probably most definitely due to this era of Chavismo that essentially ruined the country. So the moral of the story, if there is a moral, is that authoritarian rule does not bode well for any country. And so with this, I conclude this presentation, and I thank you for your attention.